managing people is kind of the perennial problem. We know that it's plagued humans since before we started throwing up pyramids. And here we are in 2026 on the cusp of superintelligence, and we still haven't solved it, right? Like essentially all the really discriminating, high-paying jobs in business are management jobs. Essentially quarterly results for any business come down to quality of management. It's very unusual that a company will like live or die on the basis of like just some pure technological deus ex machina. It's almost all about coordination problem, right? Getting people to do stuff.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you on that point. And I love how you pointed out that it is just this forever problem. If leading a team is hard, what must it take to lead teams that generate breakthroughs and accomplish things that have never been done before? I honestly spend a lot of time thinking about that question, but luckily for us, I'm not the only time that has spent time thinking about that question. Casey Handmer is the founder of Terraform Industries. He and his team are trying to give the world infinite cheap fuel by turning air and sunlight into natural gas and other essential products. His background includes working at JPL and getting his PhD at Caltech. We actually had another member of his team on the show back on episode 166 with Lucy Nurden. So if you like this discussion, definitely go check out that episode as well. As Casey points out, his team is hiring. So if you want to help solve the world's energy crisis and help the environment at the same time, absolutely visit their website. This discussion today is amazing because Casey isn't just a student of science and engineering. He is a student of history as well. In his effort to build a successful company, he spends a lot of time looking at the major industrial projects of the past, work like the Manhattan Project or the Hoover Dam, and tries to find writings by the actual leaders of those teams to get firsthand accounts of how great things are made and accomplished. This discussion goes in a lot of directions, but the theme is really all about what commonly takes teams off track. What do leaders need to do to make sure everyone is going in the right direction? And how do you create a culture where people have permission to ask hard questions or say the hard truth? Before we get into the discussion, I do need to remind you that if this is your first time listening to the show, welcome. Make sure you subscribe so you never miss a future episode. And if you are already subscribed, then I would humbly ask that you reach out to at least one other person. That, after all, is how we grow. I can't tell you how much it means to me. So with that, let's get into the discussion with Casey Handmer.
Hi, my name is Casey Handmer, and I'm not currently under duress.
Perfect. Thank you. Excellent. And so with that, we can dive right into the discussion. I'd really love to start with understanding your first experiences with people leadership. Was Terraform your first experience actually leading people, or did you do that at JPL or Hyperloop or anywhere else beforehand?
Yeah, Terraform is the first time I've had the opportunity to lead people and also pay them. Previously been involved in leadership activities in high school and in college, mostly in a kind of outdoor adventure capacity. A little bit of kind of cooperative ventures and stuff like that. But yeah, Terraform's the first time that I've had line responsibility in a corporation with legal responsibilities and stuff like that as well.
Yeah, so you definitely went all in on that one on your first experience.
You can't avoid it. Yeah, you have to kind of embrace it. And I think my hair went grey as a result. But like 20-something families depend on me not making terrible decisions for their daily bread. And it's a weighty responsibility, but also kind of a joyful burden in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. When you first took that leap, how did you think about kind of where to start? Were there any particular lessons that you kind of brought with you from managers that you have had from the past that had you kind of gave you direction, or did you just dive in and see what happened?
Yeah, I think maybe 5 years ago, I had the benefit of having some great mentors and great managers and a few maybe not so great examples to index on as well. I think that having sat on this side of the table for a while, I realized that it's pretty easy to judge and actually much harder to execute. Managing people is kind of the perennial problem. We know that it's plagued humans since before we started throwing up pyramids. And here we are in 2026 on the cusp of superintelligence, and we still haven't solved it, right? Like essentially all the really discriminating, high-paying jobs in business are management jobs. Essentially quarterly results for any business come down to quality of management. It's very unusual that a company will like live or die on the basis of like just some pure technological deus ex machina. It's almost all about coordination problem, right? Getting people to do stuff. So that much I was aware of. Read quite a lot of books on it, obviously. Some great podcasts out there as well. I think David Senra and Ty Morse has done bunch of work on this sort of stuff as well.
Yeah.
Just trying to get my head around it, just trying to understand like, how the hell is this done? Quite a lot of military stuff as well. I'm currently reading the Washington biography, the recent one.
Oh.
Just kind of fascinating stuff. One of the things that became quite obvious to me well before I started Terraform was that obviously different management styles work for different people. And I think everyone who does it kind of has to find their own way.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you on that point. And I love how you pointed out that it is just this forever problem. I remember specifically sitting down when I was at SpaceX with the head of HR, and it was just after they had landed the first Falcon 9 rocket, and kind of talking through exactly what you just said about it took 15 odd years and however many billions of dollars and however many man hours to solve this problem of landing a building on a barge in the middle of the ocean. But how much time and energy and money had been spent trying to solve the problem of getting people to work together effectively. Like it's just this continuous problem that's always evolving and changing. And I think it is exactly because of what you said about how it's a little bit different for every person. Every situation is a little bit different. Every person is a little bit different. And so you really do have to come at it from your own angle.
Yeah, it's always at the frontier. And I think the Falcon 9 landing is a good example, right? There's actually a relatively large set and a growing set of problems that can be addressed by either individuals or small teams. But kind of by definition, the ones that are really difficult, that are unsolved, that have never been solved, may never be solved. And I'm thinking here, like, think of the sort of work that like the Social Security Administration deals with on a daily basis, for example, right? Just, I don't know, 100 million recipients and 500 million edge cases kind of thing, right? Like just really nasty, horrible problems. By definition, that's going to be a coordination problem because it's not a sector of the economy that's going to attract the 0.00001 percentile talent. So you have to be able to make it work with a very, very large team of relatively undifferentiated, or I don't want to come across as like negative about this, but just like regular people, right? It's regular people, not like, Titanic super geniuses who themselves would probably struggle to solve these problems as well. And it's just always kind of good to remember to be kind of humble in the face of this kind of like bizarre contradiction of human existence, which is that we're kind of spat out on the surface of this by a unthinking natural process and left to make sense of our predicament for ourselves.
Yeah. I always love thinking about the book Sapiens and his premise in that book, that the differentiator between humans and everybody else, like why did humans beat out Neanderthals? And it's because of our ability to coordinate. Like our superpower is our ability to believe in these common myths and come together to solve these big problems. But just like with anything else, your superpower is your weakness. Like it's the hardest thing as well.
But we don't know that for sure.
Fair.
One of the exciting things I think for me is that like there's a lot of these long-standing problems in anthropology or linguistics or history or whatever that have been considered unsolvable. Like we just don't have the knowledge. We never will. It's been lost to solve it. And then some smart aleck comes along and figures out some new statistical DNA analysis technique or whatever. And then you're like, oh, yeah, actually, this dramatically constrains the set of possible events that could have occurred. I think the consensus might be that Neanderthals had lower population density on the same land, and so they just kind of got diluted. But all, you and me and all the other Europeans, like 2 or 3% Neanderthal DNA, but actually probably more like 20% by ancestry. A lot of the genes were not particularly dominant and got replaced pretty quickly.
Interesting. I'd love to go back to this idea that you mentioned about the kind of these really big problems that are always kind of gated by your ability to work together and bring people together to solve them.
Yeah.
Because especially on X, you talk a lot about, I've been getting a lot of really great book recommendations from you recently. I couldn't even believe it when I found out that General Groves wrote a firsthand account of the Manhattan Project, which was absolutely incredible to read.
It should be studied in schools. It's absolutely astounding.
Yeah.
I've been reading a lot of these books, basically going into the older obscure areas of literature, trying to find technical first-hand accounts by people who are actually there in the room doing the work. And they're not very well known and they're quite rare. And but they're usually very insightful. Whereas like Richard Rhodes spent a decade writing The Making of the Atomic Bomb, and he's a very smart guy, and that's a great book, very, very long book. But in terms of like having read it, how much of it is actually useful for me in my day-to-day running a technical enterprise? Almost none, right? It's like who did what when, but not why or how. And whereas Groves is all about the technical minutia of like, this is how I actually did the damn thing. Currently, I'm reading a recently published memoir by Rickover, which I'm hoping will have similar insights. Because there's a great Rickover biography called The Rickover Effect by his 2IC, Theodore Rockwell, which is good, but it's clear that he wasn't inside his head. He was pretty closed off. It wasn't clear how and why he was thinking the ways he did.
When did you start reading those books and finding those? I'd be interested in like kind of how you discovered that as a good way to get insight. What are some of the insights that if there are any particular insights, and kind of what is the gap between kind of, as you mentioned, those firsthand accounts versus the wider histories that are maybe more well known?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've been kind of reading incidentally at various times on all these different subjects, but I kind of went through the Stripe Press catalog at some point, and they had republished Charlie Munger's kind of memoir or series of speeches called Poor Charlie's Almanac, which is also an excellent book. And also they republished Vannevar Bush's Pieces of the Action, which I would give that like a strong B plus in this category. It's certainly a first-hand account, and it's nice and obscure. Like what it's talking about is the projects he wasn't like they weren't necessarily like the most famous projects, and just just like perspective of a grumpy old man dying in the 1970s. Good stuff. So that they were pretty good, and at that point I kind of finally realized, oh, there's a massive difference between the first-hand accounts and memoirs of the actual people involved, and then I went to GPT or something like GPT-3, like one of the early AIs, and basically began querying as to like which of these people have published first-hand accounts of their various things. Or I read through some popular histories and then went through the source material at the back of the book and was like, oh, that's interesting. So like Freedom's Forge is a very approachable, I think a really good popular history book on the history of mass production in World War II in the United States. It covers three major characters, one of whom is Henry Kaiser, who was the founder of Kaiser Permanente Healthcare, amongst like more than 100 other businesses.
It's crazy.
And I was like, oh, Kaiser's an interesting fella. Okay, let's Google. Kaiser biography. Oh, there's two of them. Okay, he died in 1969, and there were two biographies published in 1989 of all times, and then basically vanished without a trace. So I basically bought both of them, picked one up off the stack at random, and started reading it. I often read these books to my children late at night because it helps them go to sleep, and worked my way through it. And yeah, I mean, it was like a lot of who did what when, and not very much how and why. And unfortunately, I haven't yet found very much from Kaiser in his own words about why he was doing stuff. I'm sure it exists. His papers and stuff are well archived, but I'm not positioned to write that history. Why? So the last part of your question was, why is it so much better? I'm going to speculate here, but I think that in order to become noteworthy enough to become a titan of industry or something, you have to have kind of a lifelong obsession with some aspect of it, right? Actually, so for Henry Kaiser, he didn't really diversify until he was in his mid-50s, right? Until that point, he was doing mostly road building and ditch building, canals and stuff. And then he diversified into dozens and dozens of industries with a very competent team of senior executives kind of jumping around doing stuff, slipping up pieces of the US war production system that were being sold off. But yeah, you have to be pretty obsessed with that stuff. And so when you write your memoir, you're going to focus not on like, oh, and then we went to the party at like Maud's place and she served tarts and whatever. But it's going to be like, yes. And then we went to yet another interminable dinner party, but I sat in the corner staring into space, obsessed with this problem that I've been trying to solve around like standardizing the grades of 316 stainless steel so that I can have like, non-corrosive high pressure steam transfer pipes in my nuclear reactor or whatever the case may be, which is just the kind of nitty-gritty detail I'm interested in. That said, if you're not obsessed about those same sorts of things or the difficulties of running these technical projects, I would imagine that these books would not necessarily be quite as gripping a read as I find them.
Sure.
And even if you're someone who's interested in that area, I think that it definitely helps to have gotten your feet wet on the managerial front to be like, now I kind of understand the shape of the problem I'm trying to understand. And then you can read the books with that insight in mind. This is something that, a lot of people have told me over the years, which is like, romance novels are more fun after you've experienced heartbreak a few times or whatever. And I was like, okay, I believe you. But it's pretty much the same case here as well. Like, even reading a technical manual on how to disassemble and reassemble an engine is a lot more fun once you've actually done it in person.
Yeah, I think there's a level of these are the books for the nerds of the subject. Like you got to be like that's who they're written by and that's who they're written for.
Yeah.
And then I also think that's really interesting. I've started doing this actually a lot myself. I went through a really big reading phase a few years ago when I first left the military to kind of figure out what corporate life was like. And I find now going back and rereading them, they're different books because of some of those. It's like, you've probably heard the phrase, great players don't make great coaches, which sometimes is true, sometimes isn't. But often that idea comes from this gap where somebody like a Henry Kaiser, they might be saying things, they're skipping over things that like they don't even think to explain or think about that the layman doesn't understand. But once you've had a little bit of experience, you've managed some people, you've run some technical projects, it's probably a lot easier to pick out the nuances of what an expert like that is saying. That's kind of what I picked up from what you were saying.
Yeah, it's true. Actually, on the coaching point, there's an interesting side point to be made there, which is, again, everyone's mileage varies. But one of the issues that I had earlier on at Terraform, and now I understand what Jensen says when he says the first 5 years of NVIDIA was a disaster, right? It's a very unnatural thing, right? And for me, I found that the coaching aspect of the job was very natural because I brought in a founding team here at Terraform of people who were much better than me at everything they did. right?
Yeah.
And yet I still
Yeah.
wanted things to be done in a certain way. And I definitely need to be part of the conversation when it came to how things are being designed. So now it's a bit different because I'm recruiting people who know who I am, and I don't, they're often like relatively fresh grads or whatever, and I have a lot to teach them. But back then, I didn't fully appreciate that it doesn't matter how talented your co-founders or co-founding team are. Everyone needs a coach. And if you're the CEO, you're the coach, right? Like, doesn't matter how brilliant
Yeah.
your favorite sports people are, they all need a coach to say, look, you're the fastest in the world, but you can be faster, you realize. And the only thing standing between you and being faster is, a little bit more pain tolerance and a little bit more effort, and also better directed effort. So you're not wasting your time in the gym working on muscle groups that don't matter, or whatever the case may be. I'm betraying my lack of enthusiasm around sporting and physical exercise here. But yeah, it really does. There's some sports where a lot of performance is quite psychological, or it's about just stick-to-itiveness, right? Rather than being born with a particular set of genes. And I really think that's the case. There is probably a threshold of like some fundamental genetic or whatever capability necessary to be effective as a leader or a manager, but it's not that exclusive. I don't think it's that exclusive. I think it's mostly an attitude thing, and then to quote Charlie Munger, a compounding thing, right? You need to kind of get on the track of self-improvement and then run that cycle to level
Yeah.
up as quickly as you can.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the coaching point makes a lot of sense. I think it's hard to argue that the realm in which we're most often scratching at the very edges of human ability is in sports and physical performance world. One, because it's so straightforward, but every organization that does it relies on continuous coaching all the time for every aspect. And so it makes sense that in any other realm, it would be the same way. What you were just saying really ties into something that I wanted to bring up about you. You did an interview on the Relentless podcast where one of the things that it was a fantastic interview that I highly recommend everybody go listen to. There's one thing I remember you mentioning. I think the question was around what's something you've kind of changed your mind on as a leader. And what I remember hearing was kind of around this issue of almost just like, if you want to, what I took from it is, if you want your organization to really do great things, you really got to push people. And that means you're at least some of the time got to be really hard on them. Is that right? Am I remembering that correctly?
I mean, it's very easy as a manager to find a way to justify being an asshole, right? And that's not really what I'm getting
Sure.
at. Although
Yeah.
it is your job to make tough decisions. Those decisions roll to your feet, and if you don't make them, it kills the organization. And some of those decisions, just objectively, you'll feel like a bad person, right? Sometimes there's just no other way out, but it has to be done, right? It's a dirty job, and it's your job. It's what they're paying you for. I think what I was saying to Ty was it's about having the social permission to be very demanding of people. And I actually think that the number one thing that I warn people about when I promote them into positions of leadership here is, I say, the hardest part of this job is that being liked is optional, but succeeding is mandatory. And it's not just from my selfish perspective that I don't want my company to fail. It's also from the perspective of the people who are working there. And the cases of people at Terraform who are no longer at Terraform that I regret the most are the ones where the only reason that we didn't address a performance issue in time was that we didn't want to make them sad about the fact that they weren't performing right. It just got worse and worse. It's just like, the patient is bleeding. You're going to have to stop the bleeding one way or another. It's not because they're bad people or they're stupid or anything. It's just they needed a very firm hand, and I was unable to provide one when they needed it. So I feel like a bad dad in that way, right? I have young children, and young children do silly stuff all the time, and they really do depend on their parents to provide the discipline they need to get to where they need to go. And it's a little bit like that with employees as well, and at the end of the day, I've had spirited disagreements with a number of employees, and we've come away from them ultimately having a better idea of what we're about and with a great deal of respect for each other, because everyone understands it comes from a point of view of not who's right and who's wrong, but like, we need to make sure this works. And on the other hand, I've known a bunch of managers over the years who have thought that their job is a popularity contest, and they're all chummy and drinking and getting beers with their employees and so on, and getting feels really good as a human monkey to have your fellow monkeys be like, oh, you're a cool guy, right? But meanwhile, their project is failing, team's failing, no one's learning. And after the fact, these people will realize, oh, I just wasted a year working for this guy because he wasn't prepared to hold me accountable. And now when I go and try and get another job, I have to kind of scooch over that part of my resume because I wasn't achieving anything. And it's very frustrating. You don't have that many years to level up, right? In a given career, particularly if you're early career, you really need to throw yourself at a real problem and actively seek out constructive but negative feedback from people that you trust to help you get to where you need to go. No one figures it out in a vacuum. You can't learn it from a book. It's kind of a real-time thing. You need to do it every single day.
There's two things I'd love to pick up on there. One thing that I think is really helpful about a lot of people with kind of an engineering or a technical mindset is that they're very used to arguing about problems. Like I've watched two engineers just look like they were ready to kill each other in a room, and then they walk out of the room and they're fine because they were just arguing about the problem
Yeah,
and
I
they
think
can
that's healthy,
separate those
actually.
two things.
Yeah.
Yeah. How do you think about creating a culture at Terraform where that is encouraged, where you can have those vigorous disagreements, but they are positive?
I've taken a lot of inspiration on that front from Patrick and John Collison, who run Stripe, because they understand that the correct thing to do with aggressive instincts is not to deny them, but it's to channel them, right? So,
I like that.
so you remain unfailingly polite, right? But you be aggressively helpful, right? Or aggressively truth-seeking. But it's always about playing the ball and not the man. Does that make sense? So the way that this will usually work, and to be fair, like for some of the junior employees here, it can be a pretty confronting experience to have your first design review, and then I kind of open my mouth and I say, "Would you please explain this?" Right? And probably a third of the time, it comes from me just genuinely not understanding what they're doing because it hasn't been written down properly or because I just don't know that much about some stuff, right? And some of the time I'm just like, I think they've made an error of judgment here, but I want them to explain how they got there. But it doesn't begin with a standing on the table, pointing a finger and screaming at them saying, "You fucked this up again, you complete idiot." Even though it might feel like that sometimes. It begins with a, "Can you please explain what you're thinking about, how you thought about this?" And usually that's the point where like it's kind of the invitation to dance. It's the invitation to jump off and really kind of drill in and see if we can understand what the core problem is. And I just think of an example just a couple of weeks ago where we're like basically talking around the subject on how to do sizing for a particular kind of radial heat transfer problem within or what's called a chemical reactor. And at some point I said, what's the total delta T we're talking here? Like this reaction is a lot slower than our other reference reaction. Can we just like expand these pipes to the maximum size allowable under law? And they're like, "I don't know about that." And I said, "Well, let's double check." And it turns out that with a fairly trivial design change in another part of the system, we can delete an entire subsystem, right? So like you could literally spend 6 months drilling in and redesigning the hell out of this entire subsystem just to like, improve its performance by 10%. Or you say, well, why are we actually doing that? Right? And then just delete it all. And you never spend another minute on it. But look around you. The world is full of failing projects and failing products
Yeah.
that have obviously
Yeah.
never asked this question.
Why do you think that is? Like, it's something that I've always been intrigued by about, when we think about the phrase of the year is, or decade is first principles thinking. Why are asking those questions, those basic questions of what are we doing here? What if we did this?
Yeah.
What if we did it differently? Do we even
A
need
lot
this?
of people talk
Why
about
are
first
those?
principles, but almost no one knows how to do it.
Exactly.
And actually, just recently, I've instituted a policy whereby every week at our stand-up, someone on the team gets to give a 10-minute whiteboard presentation on a first principles analysis of something related to their design work. And yeah, in 10 minutes, you don't have enough time to really go into depth, but you do have enough time to draw a couple of diagrams, draw some arrows on the diagrams and say, this is the core problem here, right?
Yeah.
And that's the key piece of it, really. Now, why is it like this? You said you served in the military. I'm sorry, I don't, which branch and capacity?
I was a pilot in the Air Force.
Oh, cool. So how many military men are dead throughout history because their leaders and their generals and so on were unwilling to face perhaps potentially socially unsavory fact?
Quite a few.
Probably hundreds of millions, like a
Yeah.
shitload, right? And it comes back to that kind of question of social permission. And I think that, there are some cultures in particular that have really had to, in the modern era, struggle with this idea of like, how do you make sure that the less politicized junior employee speaks up and says, "I don't really understand this. Can you explain it?" That they don't just get trampled under the boss says it's fine. But essentially, any country that has gotten serious about a space program has had to tackle this issue because the passing grade for launching is 100%. And if you look through the history of, the US space program throughout history, actually, but also in particular like the East and South Asian communities where there's very much a kind of seniority-based social power structure. Like the Japanese just blew up another rocket, right?
Yeah.
So like they're still working their way through this problem, obviously.
Yeah.
It's kind of bizarre. But yeah, the funny thing is, like, I think Mark Andreessen said this, like, people will be willing to tolerate almost any amount of chronic pain to avoid even the smallest amount of acute pain.
Yeah.
Right? And the acute pain is the senior person saying, actually, I don't know. Or, no, the junior guy is right and I was wrong. Or this employee is not in the right position in this company and it needs to be solved and everyone's going to get upset about it. Right? And instead, they'll just put up with basically their organization being destroyed from the inside out indefinitely until, ultimately they lose the war. If you read your history of World War II, this is basically how the Japanese lost the Second World War. Right? They like, just from like Pearl Harbor on, it was just like a whole series of unforced errors due to poor human coordination. And like within 4 years, the United States had invented a nuclear weapon and then dropped it on 2 of their cities. It's hard to lose a war worse than that.
What you're saying kind of reminds me of, had this thought of, I don't necessarily like the terminology of like wartime leadership versus peacetime leadership. But if you use that, I was trying to think of like what's the difference between these two. And to me, one of the fundamental things is that in peacetime, it's better to do nothing than make a mistake. And in wartime, it's better to make a mistake than do nothing.
Ooh, I
And I
like that.
think that speaks to this kind of this idea of this like acute pain of just like wartime. It means even if we separate out of actual war, it's just like things are happening really quickly and the stakes are high. And so you cannot stand still. That's like the worst thing that you can do.
Yeah.
And it forces a change.
The way I would think about it is like, what is the value you place on pragmatism? And I don't think pragmatism is a dirty word. And actually, like, I wrote a blog post about this last year in response to kind of my despair that the overall strength of the American political system is currently being weakened by weakness on the progressive side. I think that actually I'm reading this Washington biography right now. But like something that the Americans got right is this idea that no, you need a plaza where all the different ideas can come together and fight it out, intellectual way. And that America does really well when the best ideas from the progressives mix with the best ideas from the conservatives and the best ideas from libertarians and whoever else is around. And they all kind of get together and you end up with like the best of everything, right? But right now, like the best ideas of the progressives are probably not that good and they're pretty discredited at a national scale from having lost election after election and California's various woes. And like, if there's a one-word prescription to solve this problem, it's like pragmatism, right? Like, and I feel like Newsom understands this, but you need to kind of privilege pragmatism over ideological purity if you actually want to deliver results for the people you're governing. And that's true whether it's a family or running a business or something. But like at the end of the day, if your business is spending more money than it's making, it's not going to be around for very long.
Well, one final question I want to ask you, because that kind of goes back to how we started of, looking at the industrialists of the past, is one of the things that I've heard you mention before, in regards to Elon biographies and kind of you've almost despaired about the lack of interest in what's the outlier, like what's causing this outlier. How is it that somebody like Elon is able to push so many companies so much farther than kind of all the other contemporaries? From your perspective, do you have an answer to that? What do you think is causing these companies to be an outlier?
Well, I've speculated a bit. I think it's pretty clear that no matter how brilliant Elon is, he wasn't able to do this overnight, right?
Yes.
So it's definitely something that requires compounding over a long period of time. And then it's definitely something that is occurring on more than one axis. So if you look at companies which are built around like exceptional execution on one particular thing, then they tend to be quite spiky in terms of their attributes and maybe not as stable. And so I would say like, it turns out that if you're prepared to fight for long enough and just be like a few % better on all the most important areas than your competitors, then you have the possibility of having a really big outsized return, like we've seen here.
Yeah.
There's also, we kind of touched on this at the very beginning, this question of like, how do small companies solving important problems become large companies still solving important problems without basically becoming bogged down by bureaucracy or like counterproductive bureaucracy. And one of the things that I always hear from my friends who work at the Elon companies is that they're very chaotic. It's always just like a boiling, like hair on fire catastrophe at all times. And that obviously has all kinds of negative effects that are felt by customers and employees alike. But I think one of the major undervalued positive effects of that is that it's never really lost that dynamism, or like the dynamism is still strong that it would have had as an early startup as well. And so it's always worthwhile bearing in mind that there's like, once you're like, oh, well, we're a serious company now with 80 people, time to put processes in place, that you're walling off the path to the very out of distribution upside, as well as walling off numerous paths to terrible outcomes due to lack of coordination. I also think that Elon's leadership ability must be underrated. I think that it's just not well appreciated that how extraordinary a character he is. At the same time, you do say like, well, it's a big world and a big country. Like somehow in the 1780s or 1790s, the United States was able to scrape together 50 or 60 founders, of whom probably half a dozen or a dozen or so were considered really exceptional statesmen by the standards of their era and even our era. And yet here in a country that is 100 times richer and 100 times larger, it's kind of bizarre, isn't it? You think like, surely this would saturate at some point, right? Like there are good generals and bad generals, but like surely there's a ceiling, but maybe there isn't. It's certainly my subjective experience as I've kind of grown up in this world that, you go to a leadership conference somewhere and you get to meet these people and in a room with kind of ever more rarefied sets of leaders or whatever. And it certainly seems to me that like there's no real ceiling, right? Like you can sit around a table with 10 people and it's pretty clear like one or two of them are head and shoulders above the rest. And then you go to their table where it's all people at that quality and there's still one or two are head and shoulders above the rest. It keeps on going. Yeah. Actually, that would probably be the case in military as well. Like I think we look up to Napoleon and Julius Caesar and a handful of others as being like many standard deviations beyond what you should expect to be a possible outcome under the laws of physics as we understand it.
It's really interesting to me. I 100% agree with you that curve just keeps going up and up. And yet individuals are really only able to distinguish a couple levels above them.
Yeah, for sure.
And then everybody above that appears the same, even though they're not. And so
Yeah,
it becomes harder and harder
it's
for a
very
mass
legible,
audience, yeah.
right? And I think that's why like we have thousands of books on
Yeah.
business and organizational management, and none of them are really any good,
Yeah.
right? Like
Yeah.
you can't. Whereas like I could give you the name of a physics textbook, and you could read it from cover to cover, do the exercises, and like you'd be good enough at physics,
Yeah.
basically, to do physics in any organization on earth. But
Yeah.
I don't know if that's the case for manager. In fact, I know it is not the case. No one has yet written
Yeah.
the leadership book. Actually, in the military, how do they train you in the Air Force to
It's
think about leadership?
interesting. Yeah, I mean, you spend tons of time because I went to the Air Force Academy as well. And so we spent an outsized amount of time thinking about leadership. We went to multiple leadership schools. And yet when I left the military, I still felt completely unprepared for for leading people, which was kind of interesting. Because I think it speaks to your point of context is really, really important. I think there's a lot of similar trends, but there's so many differences in the military. One of the things that I always mention to people that is hard to comprehend for people who've never been in the military is that leaders in the military have no ability to control who is on their team. People show up and people leave. And you as the leader have no control over that. And so you have to be 100% dialed into.
Yeah, that was something that Rickover got very upset about. In
Yeah,
fact, I think he ultimately like slowed down the rate at which his people were rotating. Okay, who is the most exceptional Air Force leader that you've studied and looked up to?
I mean, I can definitely tell you the ones that I've looked up to more closely that were just kind of like my individual leaders.
My follow-up question is going to be, what was it in their style, or their leadership style, that really made a difference for you? So I'm just kind of curious from your perspective, like because everyone knows about like Curtis LeMay or Hap Arnold or whatever, like who are these people?
Yeah, I think the ability to, especially for really high level leaders, the ability to connect with you and make it seem personal, not impersonal, even though you know in the back of your mind that it is impersonal, if that makes a sense. These generals who are meeting and talking with hundreds or thousands of people on a relatively daily basis, the ability for them to kind of like stop time and connect with you is the thing that really helps connect you with the mission. That's what I experienced anyway.
Yeah, that's definitely
Makes sense.
An important thing. And actually something that comes through Plutarch's Lives on Julius Caesar and also Napoleon's history, right?
Yeah.
Which is that they would actually get in the thick of it. And I think in Washington's case as well, like really expose themselves to danger and to hardship. And actually Hannibal, the Punic general as well, was reputed to, basically be seen as single-minded and tough and part of the action. I think that's an important part of it. Actually, there's an interesting question as well, which is, I now know this to be true, but if I had not had the example or seen it firsthand, I would not have suspected it to be the case because it's alien to my personal experience. But it turns out that like probably 80% of the value of the coaching that I provide for my employees here is not even me being like, hey, try to do it this way. It's just me being present in the room with my eyes open, looking at what they're doing. And like, how is it the case that just having like the manager or the boss be physically present, like paying attention to what's going on, improves the output so dramatically? I don't know. It's weird. Like you would think if you're a well-paid engineer who's motivated extrinsically and intrinsically just to become as good as you can, then like you'd be able to run that loop in your head, like, what will the boss think of this when he sees it? But no, it makes a huge difference just to be like present and be like, okay, show me your part. How does it work? Why did you do it that way?
It has very little to do with the giving the suggestions, but simply posing the question or prompting them to pose the question themselves.
Yeah, some of them eventually learn to internalize that a bit. You have to learn to hold yourself accountable if you want to grow up.
Yeah, I mean, and that's, kind of, you had mentioned this in the beginning, this idea of the compounding and how you get better is, you as the leader are trying to push these feedback loops on your organization. But if you want to rise in an organization, probably the best way is to figure out how to push those feedback loops on yourself even faster than the organization. And that's how you would rise through an organization.
Yeah, of course. I mean, for me personally, one of the most marvelous things of this particular path I'm on is that it has opened the door to me into the world of other aspirational hardware, in particular founders. Yeah. One of the impressions that I got from my youthful obsession with 19th century British naval history is just I guess the 18th as well, just like the loneliness of command. And I kind of expected this going in. I didn't start Terraform expecting it to be like super fun, but there are limits to the extent to which you can fraternize with or really fully communicate your concerns even to your like trusted advisors and stuff like that. It's just the nature of the beast. And that was certainly the case on a ship, obviously.
Yeah.
For obvious reasons. But captain to captain, when you're in port having a chat over a glass of wine or a nice snack or something, you're all facing pretty much the same problems. And you compare notes on good books to read and good investors to talk to and helpful program officers in various government agencies and stuff like that makes a huge difference.
Yeah. And that's what I think is so great about the time we're living in right now with podcasts and just content everywhere, as much as so much of it is overwhelming and maybe not helpful, but it allows for, it's still not captain to captain, but some of these discussions with people who are going through it that the rest of us can learn from and get some of those insights from. So it's always great to get that inside view really in real time and not when we're getting the crotchety 70-year-old version of what happened back 50 years ago.
Well, it's still better than nothing. Part of the shame is that like nowadays, a lot of the senior people, particularly in the AI space, for example, they're all like bound up by fear of litigation and NDAs and stuff like that, right? So like none of this stuff is really getting written down or being written down by people who are very authoritative, let's just say, which is a shame. Like think about posterity, right? Like this might be the most interesting period in human history. And basically for fear of like a low chance of a potentially annoying lawsuit, no one is writing down what they actually felt and thought about it. And so we just won't know. It's like, it's unbelievably frustrating. So keep a secret diary and just keep it secret.
That's a great idea.
Whereas, how thankful am I that Leslie Groves, someone who I'm sure if I worked for him, I would have hated him, right? And vice versa.
Yeah.
Right. But how grateful am I that he lived long enough and took good enough notes and had good enough secretarial assistance that he was able to write this stuff down.
Yeah, really incredible. As we close out, we haven't touched on Terraform yet at all. I'm going to mention it in the intro. What's the next big milestone for you all?
Yeah, so just for context, in case you want to splice this in somewhere, Terraform, my startup, is making synthetic fuels, natural gas and methanol and a few other things from sunlight and air and water, generic materials, create infinite fuel for humanity forever. We're hiring many opportunities for ambitious people, technical people to come and level up to challenge themselves on the best problems that humanity currently faces. And I can't guarantee you'll have, pure hedonic bliss at every moment, but I can guarantee you won't waste a single minute and you'll become the best version of yourself you can possibly be. So yeah, we're working on that. And we're also, we want to do some metals as well. So don't count yourself out just because you're an organic chemist or something like that. We want to do pretty much all the primary materials.
Amazing. And is there a big next milestone you're working towards right now?
Yeah, it's actually, when we started out, like the milestones were kind of few and far between, but now the team has reached a certain size, we're kind of hitting fairly major achievements every few weeks. The next major thing I'm looking forward to is turning over some dirt at our test site. We've acquired and permitted a test site, and it's time to start the construction phase, which is very exciting. That should be up and running by the summer. And then we're also in the process of building like the first kind of real scale methanol production reactor. We're qualifying our latest electrolyzer balance of plant. We have our next generation electrolyzer production system is currently either being assembled or all the parts are on their way to us. And direct air capture, like a bunch of different cool stuff's happening there. We're in the process of building absorption beds and CO2 release systems and all kinds of fun stuff. So it's all happening.
Awesome. That's exciting. Well, thank you so much. I know you have a lot to do, so thank you so much for taking the time. This has been a fantastic discussion.
You're most welcome.
Thank you so much for listening in on the conversation. I hope you got as much out of it as I did. If you are a manager yourself and you're looking for more insight onto how to better lead your team, please make sure to check out some of our other amazing episodes. If you are responsible for developing leaders in your organization and you're struggling to make programs that actually change behavior and actually impact the business, please reach out so we can figure out how to make your organization better every day. Drop me a line using matt@bettereverydaystudios.com. I look forward to the conversation.